The first thing I noticed about her was that she was trying very hard not to look at me. Not in the shy way. Not in the way people avoid eye contact on the subway because they don't want to start a conversation. This was deliberate. Controlled. Like she had trained herself not to look directly at things she found dangerous. I was standing in the middle of the laundromat at 11:45 at night, one sock on, one sock off, trying to figure out why the machine had eaten $40 of my quarters and returned exactly 0 rotations. And she walked in like she owned the night itself. Tall. Dark jacket. Eyes that did one full sweep of the room the second she stepped through the door, cataloging everything including me, and then purposefully looked away. I should have gone back to fighting the machine. I didn't. Her name, I would find out much later, was Sable. And she already knew mine. But that's the part of the story that will make you want to put something through a wall, so let's start at the beginning. The actual beginning. The part where my life was already on fire before she walked into it and made everything simultaneously worse and the only thing worth surviving for. My name is Savara. I am 22 years old. I work 3 jobs. My father is dying in a hospital bed on the 4th floor of St. Mary's General and has been for the past 7 months. I have $17 and a broken laundromat token in my pocket. I have not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in what feels like a geological era. And apparently, I am also a werewolf. That last part is still new information to me. It has not been going well. I found out on a Thursday, which feels like the universe's idea of a joke because nothing catastrophic should happen on a Thursday. Thursdays are beige. Thursdays are forgettable. Thursdays are for eating whatever's left in the fridge and watching something mindless until you fall asleep on the couch. Instead, my father called me from his hospital room at 2 in the morning with that particular quietness in his voice that I had learned to fear. The quietness that meant he had been holding something for a long time and could not hold it any longer. He told me about my mother. Not the version I had grown up with. Not the gentle lie about the car accident when I was 4 years old. The real version. The version where my mother, Vera, was a werewolf. Where she came from a bloodline that had run quiet and careful and hidden for generations. Where she met my very human, very unprepared father at a market stall in a city neither of them was from, and he fell completely in love with her before he understood a single thing about what her life actually contained. He told me she was taken when I was 3. Not killed. Taken. By people who hunted things like her. And then he stopped himself and said, things like her, and then corrected it immediately, desperately, and said things like you, baby. And I sat on my kitchen floor with the phone pressed so hard against my ear that it left a mark, and I did not say anything for a very long time. If you are new here, welcome to Daydream BL and GL. And also welcome to the most chaotic story you are going to hear this year. Hit that subscribe button right now because I promise you, you have not heard anything yet, and what is coming next is going to change everything you think you understand about this story. My father could not tell me much. He was a human man who had loved a woman he barely had the vocabulary for and done his best to prepare a daughter for a life he could not fully map. He had taught me to fight. Actual fighting. The kind with your hands and your body weight and your elbows when necessary. He said he learned it from watching me at age 7 pick up a stick and go after a dog twice my size that had cornered our neighbor's cat, and he decided then that I had something in me that needed proper direction rather than suppression. I thought he just believed in self-defense. Now I understand he was quietly terrified of the moment it would become something else entirely. He told me to go home and look under the loose board beneath my bed. He had put it there 6 years ago when the doctors first started finding things in his blood work that worried them. He said he hoped I would never need it, but he needed me to have it. The key was small and brass and old. The safe it opened was the size of a shoebox, and it was sitting inside a bag inside another bag inside a box at the very back of my closet shelf, hidden under winter coats I never wear because I run hot all the time and now I know why. Inside the safe was a notebook. My father's handwriting. 47 pages of it. I sat on my floor and I read every single word, and I want you to understand something. I want you to truly absorb this. My father, This man who loves me more than anything, this man who threw himself into researching how to help me, compiled 47 pages of werewolf survival guidance based almost entirely on cartoons. Not even the serious ones. There was a full page dedicated to the theory that silver jewelry worn voluntarily by a werewolf could help them self-regulate during a moon cycle because, and I am reading this directly, the wolf in the show wore a silver bracelet and seemed calmer than the others. There was a section on diet that recommended, I am not making this up, avoiding cheese after 9 p.m. There was a hand-drawn diagram of a breathing exercise that he had labeled wolf breath control, and it looked exactly like something a children's television character would demonstrate with their hands shaped like little stars. I cried. Not because it was useless, though it mostly was. I cried because of how hard he tried. Because I could see him sitting somewhere, probably in that hospital bed, watching things on his tablet and writing things down in his careful handwriting and believing with everything in him that he was helping his daughter survive something he could not survive with her. I tried the breathing exercise anyway. It did not work. What did work, accidentally, was punching my kitchen wall at 3 in the morning when the shift happened for the first time and the sound my knuckles made against the plaster seemed to startle something inside me back into order. I stood there with plaster dust on my hand and my heart hammering and whatever had been rising in me retreating, and I thought, okay, we are figuring this out. The scratches had started 2 weeks before the safe, before the phone call, before any of it made sense. I would wake up with thin lines on my forearms and once along my collarbone, and I had convinced myself I was doing it in my sleep from stress. I bought softer sheets. I trimmed my nails down to nothing. The nails grew back by morning. Longer than before. That was the first thing I Googled that led me somewhere real. Not werewolf, obviously. I wasn't there yet. I Googled rapid nail growth stress-related, and then fingernail regrowth overnight medical, and then at 4 in the morning, sitting in the blue light of my phone. I typed why do I wake up feeling like I ran a marathon, and why is everything louder than it used to be, and why did I almost bite my coworker today when he grabbed my shoulder from behind. That last one I deleted before hitting search. The research I started doing on my own was not graceful. It was a disaster with occasional breakthroughs. I found forums. I found people who were clearly not what I was, but were writing about experiences that rhymed with mine. I found one thread, buried deep in a site that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early internet, written by someone who clearly knew things. Real things. Technical things about bloodlines and transition cycles, and something they called the secondary nature, which was apparently what happened when the wolf part of you started waking up and deciding it had opinions. I printed it out. I highlighted it. I cross-referenced it with my father's notebook in a way that was genuinely painful because his notebook kept contradicting the thread in ways that suggested he had perhaps watched a lot of very inaccurate television. I was getting better, though. Slowly. Clumsily. I stopped the shift 3 times in 1 week using a method I had developed myself involving cold water, the breathing exercise adapted from my father's star hands diagram, and saying my own name out loud twice. I don't know why the name thing worked. It just did. Like some part of me that was still entirely Zavara needed to hear it. And then the book appeared under my door. I came home from my second shift, the one at the diner that ends at midnight, and there it was. No envelope. No note. Just a book, slim and dark covered, slid neatly beneath my apartment door like someone had known exactly how far it would need to travel to clear the gap. The title was not in English. The text inside was mostly, with sections in 2 other languages I did not recognize. But the parts one could read were unlike anything I had found in any forum or search result. Specific. Technical. Compassionate in a strange way, like whoever had written it genuinely wanted the reader to survive. There was one page that had been marked with a small folded corner. I do not know if it was marked for me or if it was just old wear on the book, but the page it opened to was titled Half-Born, and the first line read, "The child of a wolf and a human does not transition. They emerge. Slowly. Over months. And what emerges will be more than either parent alone, if they survive the emergence intact." I read that line 4 times. I sat with it for a long time. Then I looked at my door and I thought about who could have put it there, and I felt something I did not entirely have a name for. Not fear. Not quite. Something adjacent to it that had warmth in it, which made absolutely no sense. I should have been afraid. Someone knew what I was. Someone knew where I lived. Someone had been close enough to my door to slide something under it, and I had not heard them, which meant either they were very quiet or I had been so exhausted that my body had just given up on alerting me to things. Instead, I felt, for the first time in months, like someone was paying attention. I went back to the laundromat the next night because I still had dirty uniforms and no functional machine in my building. Same machine. Different night. Same $40 robbery in progress. And she walked in. Sable. I did not know her name yet. I knew her jacket. I knew the way she moved, which was with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned to be very quiet in their body. I knew that her eyes did the sweep thing again and landed on me and then away, and this time I noticed that away was not disinterest. Away was effort. I said the machine took my money in a tone that did not invite conversation, and she walked past me and put her hand flat against the side of the machine, and it started. Just like that. One flat palm against the side of it, and it hummed to life. I stared at her. She kept her eyes on the machine. I said, "How did you do that?" And she said, "These things just need to know you mean business," and she almost smiled and did not quite get there, and walked to the machine 2 rows over and started loading her own laundry, like she had not just done something unreasonable. I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself lots of things in those early days that I would later have to personally apologize to myself for believing. We did not talk much that night. A few sentences. I told her I worked at the diner 2 blocks over, and she said she knew the place in a way that could have meant anything. She asked if I lived in the building, and I said close enough. She nodded. When I got home that night, there was a note on my door. Not under it. On it. Folded once and pressed against the wood where I couldn't miss it. It said the cold water method is good, but you are relying on it too heavily. When you run out of cold water, you will need something else. Try pressure. Your own hands against your own sternum. You are the anchor. I stood in my hallway for a very long time. I looked both ways. Nothing. I took the note inside and I put it next to the book, and I stood in my kitchen, and I thought about the girl with the dark jacket who had not quite smiled at me and who moved like she was very practiced at being invisible. I pressed my hand against my sternum. Something in me went still. Not the wolf still. Not the forced suppression I had been white-knuckling for weeks. Something else. Something that felt like it came from deeper down. I don't know if I started trusting her in that moment or if I started falling in that moment. Looking back, I think they might have been the same thing happening simultaneously. And here is what I did not know then. Here is the thing that will make you understand why the story cuts as deep as it does. She had a file on me. Had had it for 3 months before that laundromat. Had been watching me, tracking me, building the case for an organization she had given her entire life to, an organization that had told her she was a protector, that had given her a purpose and a mission and a story about her dead mother to fuel every single hunt she had ever done. She was the best they had. Precise. Loyal. Clean record. Never lost a target. She was supposed to deliver me before the next moon cycle. And she was the one leaving me notes on how to survive. I need you to sit with that for a second. I need you to really feel the shape of that before we go any further. Comment below what you think she was feeling in those moments, because I have thought about it every day since I found out, and I still don't have a clean answer. My father had what the doctors called a difficult week in month 3 of his hospitalization. Difficult week was their phrase. What it looked like from my side was 2 days where I was not sure he would be there when I arrived, and 1 night where I sat in the parking lot of the hospital for 40 minutes before I could make myself go inside because I was terrified that going inside would make it real in a way the parking lot hadn't yet. I called out of 1 shift. I couldn't help it. The next morning I woke up with scratches down my back that I could not have made myself, and a broken window I did not remember breaking, and my neighbor knocking on my door to ask if everything was okay because she had heard sounds. I said yes. I said I was so sorry. I cleaned up the glass. I went to the hospital and I sat with my father, and he held my hand and he told me I had my mother's eyes. He said it the way he always said it, like it was the finest thing he could think of to tell me. And I sat there with scratches on my back and glass in the trash, and something building in my chest that was grief and rage and love all wound around each other. And I thought about a woman I barely remembered who apparently died fighting to protect me. I did not know yet that she hadn't died at all. I did not know she was somewhere in the dark, barely there, being slowly emptied of everything that made her what she was. I did not know that the organization Sable worked for had been doing it for years. I did not know that the woman who had tried to warn my mother, who had risked everything to get a message to her before they came, was Sable's mother. And I did not know that Sable's mother had been silenced for it. Not by wolves. By the people who signed Sable's checks. What I knew that day was only that my father was tired and small in his hospital bed, and the scratches on my back itched, and I had a double shift starting in 4 hours, and the book on my kitchen table had a section I hadn't finished reading yet. And that somewhere in this city there was a woman who knew what I was and had decided, for reasons I could not yet understand, to help me anyway. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was the thing I held on to. I don't know if you've ever been in a moment where everything is collapsing and one small thing that shouldn't matter ends up being the weight that keeps you from going under. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to make sense. Sometimes it's just a folded note pressed against a door that says you're the anchor, and you think, fine. Fine. Then I'll be the anchor. The second time I saw Sable was not at the laundromat. It was outside the hospital. I came out at 9 in the evening after visiting hours ended, and she was across the street in a way that was almost casual. Almost. She was looking at her phone. Her shoulders were doing the thing where they were very deliberately relaxed, which I was beginning to understand meant she was working at appearing unbothered. I stopped. She did not look up immediately. When she did, it was unhurried, like she was surprised to find me there, and she was not good enough at that particular lie for me to believe it. I crossed the street. I stood in front of her. I said, "You left those notes." She said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I said, "You left those notes, and you were at the laundromat, and you know something about what I am, and I need you to tell me right now what is happening." She looked at me for a long time. The phone was still in her hand. The screen had gone dark. She said, "I think you should go home, Zavara." My name in her mouth was the most frightening thing that had happened to me in a month of frightening things, because I had never told her my name. She knew it. She had always known it. I took a step back. She let me. And she looked at me with something in her face that was not quite guilt and not quite apology, and was, if I am being honest, something that looked terrifyingly like worry. She said, "Please go home." And then, almost so quietly I could have imagined it, "Be careful tonight." I went home. I was not careful. I don't mean I did something reckless. I mean I sat in my apartment and I read the rest of the book, and I found a passage near the back that described something called a bloodline anchor, a wolf whose particular lineage produced something unique, something that had been hunted specifically for centuries, not to destroy it, but to use it, and the passage used a word I had to look up, and the word meant harvest. I put the book down. I picked up my phone. I looked at the number my father had given me months ago, the one he said belonged to someone who might be able to help if things got bad, a number I had never called because things getting bad felt like an abstract future problem and not a tonight problem. Tonight problem. I called it. It rang 4 times. A woman answered. Old. Careful. She said only yes. I said, "My name is Zavara and my mother was Vera, and I found the book and I think someone is hunting me." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I thought she had hung up. Then she said, "Child, where are you right now?" And her voice had the particular texture of someone trying very hard to stay calm because the alternative is too large to hold. I told her. She said, "Do not open your door for anyone tonight. Not anyone. Do you understand me?" I said yes. She said, "Your mother was not killed, Zavara." And the floor came up to meet me even though I was already sitting down. She said, "Your mother has been held since you were 3 years old." She said, "The people who took her have been taking from her for years." She said, "You are the reason they are no longer satisfied with what they have, and you are the reason their best hunter has been watching you for months." I sat on my kitchen floor. I thought about the scratches on my back. I thought about my father's notebook with its cartoon breathing exercises and its cheese curfew. I thought about a woman I had spent 19 years mourning who was apparently somewhere alive and being slowly hollowed out. I thought about Sable's face outside the hospital. The thing in her expression I had not been able to name. I thought maybe I could name it now. She knew. Not all of it. Maybe not that part. But she knew something was wrong with the place she had been delivering wolves to for years, and she had not let herself look at it directly until something about me made looking away impossible. I pressed my hand against my sternum. I said my name out loud twice. Zavara. Zavara. Anchor. Then I got up off the floor and I went to my window and I looked down at the street. She was there. Sable. Standing under the light at the corner with her back to my building in a way that was not accidental. She was facing out. Not in. She was not watching me. She was watching for anything coming toward me. I watched her for a long time. Then I did the thing I would later describe to my father as either the bravest or the most catastrophically unhinged decision I had ever made, and I went downstairs and I opened the door and I stepped out onto the street and I said her name. She turned around. I said, I know you have a file on me. I know you were supposed to hand me over. I know something about what you've been doing and what it actually means, and I think you know it too. She said nothing. I said my mother is alive. Something moved across her face that I had never seen on anyone before. It was not one emotion. It was all of them, stacked on top of each other, fighting for the surface. I said, help me find her. The wind moved between us. She looked at me like I was something she had not prepared for and had no protocol for, and was also, underneath all of that professional composure, devastated to be standing in front of. She said, you have no idea what you're asking me to do. I said, I know exactly what I'm asking you to do. She looked away. Down the street. Back at me. She said, I have a car. I said, I know. She said, this will go wrong before it goes right. I said, I know that too. And she looked at me, Sable, with her careful eyes and her trained stillness and her years of building walls around questions she could not afford to ask, and she said, okay. Just that. Okay. And we walked to her car in the dark, and neither of us said anything, because sometimes the thing that needs to be said is too large for words yet, and you just have to start moving and trust that the rest will come. I did not know then what we would find when we finally found my mother. I did not know what Sable would discover about herself and her own history and the woman who raised her. I did not know how many things would break before anything healed. What I knew was the warmth of her walking beside me and the cold of the night air and the sound of my own name in my own head like a thing I was still learning to hold on to. Zavara. Anchor. Something was coming. I was going to be ready. And if you are still here, if you have followed every single word of this story, and you feel the way I think you feel right now, then you already know that what happens next changes everything for both of them in ways that neither of them will see coming. Drop a comment below with one word for how you are feeling right now, because I read every single one. And if this story has its claws in you the way I hope it does, share it. Because Zavara and Sable's story is only just beginning, and what is waiting in the dark for both of them is bigger than either of them knows. We are nowhere near done. Her car was a black SUV that was so aggressively clean it made me feel personally attacked. I am talking not a single receipt. Not one forgotten water bottle rolling around in the back. No rogue French fry from 3 weeks ago living its best life under the seat. Nothing. Just clean dark interior and a faint smell of something sharp and professional and slightly intimidating. I looked at my own jacket, which had a pen stain on the left sleeve and what I was fairly certain was dried soup from my diner shift, and I sat in her passenger seat like someone who had been personally invited to feel inadequate. She started the engine without saying anything. I said, your car is very clean. She said, thank you. I said, it is actually unsettling. She glanced at me sideways. Said nothing. Pulled out of the parking spot with the kind of smooth, controlled movement that suggested she had never in her life accidentally bumped a curb while parallel parking. I bump curbs constantly. I have made peace with it. I pressed my hand against the window and looked out at the city moving past us and tried to organize my thoughts into something useful, and instead my brain, which had apparently decided that tonight was a great night to completely abandon me, served up the following internal monologue. She has very good hands on that steering wheel. That is not relevant information, Zavara. File that away. Delete the file. Burn the filing cabinet. I said, where are we going? She said, somewhere safe. I said, that is an extremely vague answer for someone who is supposed to be helping me. She said, I am helping you. Vague is helping you right now. I said I need you to know that I've been awake for approximately 19 hours, and I work again at 6 a.m., and I am running on diner coffee and whatever that granola bar was that I found in my jacket pocket that I am not entirely sure was from this week. She looked at me again. Longer this time. She said, when did you last actually sleep? I said, define actually. She said, more than 3 hours. I thought about it genuinely. I counted backwards. I said I think it was before my father went into the hospital, so that would be 7 months ago, give or take. The car was quiet for a moment. She said, Zavara. I said, I know. She said, that is not sustainable. I said, I am aware, Sable. I am a werewolf in the middle of an incomplete transformation, working 3 jobs while my father watches cartoon wolf documentaries on his hospital tablet and writes me guides that recommend I avoid cheese after 9 p.m. Sustainability left the building months ago. She made a sound. Small. Almost nothing. I turned to look at her. She was not smiling exactly. But the corner of her mouth had done something that in a different person in a different life might have become a smile if it had been given more time and encouragement. I filed that away too. Did not burn that filing cabinet. The place she took me was an apartment above a laundry supply shop on a street I had walked down 100 times without ever looking up. 3rd floor. The kind of building that has a door that sticks in stairs that announce every single step and a hallway that smells like old wood and someone's dinner from 4 hours ago. The apartment itself was the opposite of her car. Books everywhere. Not organized. Not shelved in any way that suggested a system. Just stacked and leaning and spread open and piled on surfaces like they had fallen from the sky and landed wherever gravity decided. A map on the wall with pins in it. A table with 3 laptops open at different angles. A coffee mug that had been there long enough to leave a ring on the wood. I stood in the doorway and looked at it and felt something loosen slightly in my chest, because this was a space that had been lived in by someone who was too busy thinking to be tidy, and I understood that language fluently. I said, this is not what I expected. She said, what did you expect? I said something that matched the car. She almost smiled again. She was dangerously close to smiling, and then she put something away in her face and became professional again and said, sit down, and gestured at the chair nearest the table. I sat. She opened one of the laptops and turned it toward me. I looked at the screen. It was a file. My file. A photograph of me at the top that I was almost certain had been taken outside my apartment building because I was wearing the jacket with the soup stain and carrying the exact bag I had carried to my diner shift last Tuesday. Beneath the photo was information that should not have been possible to compile. My address. My work schedule. My father's hospital. His diagnosis. His room number. My mother's name. I stared at that last part for a long time. Vera. Listed under the category that said subject origin, and beneath it the word bloodline, and beneath that a series of numbers and classifications that meant nothing to me but clearly meant something to whoever had built this file. I said, how long have you had this? She said, 3 months. I said, and you were supposed to hand me over to the organization after 3 months of surveillance. She said, yes. I said, but you didn't. She said, no. I said, why? She sat down across from me. She put her hands flat on the table in a way that looked like she was studying herself and said, I don't have a clean answer for that. I looked at her hands on the table and then at her face, and I thought about the notes on my door and the book and the way she had been standing outside my building with her back to it watching the street, and I said, I think you do have an answer. I think you just don't like what it is. She looked at me with an expression that was difficult to interpret and then said, you are very direct for someone who found out they were a werewolf less than a month ago. I said, I found out officially less than a month ago. My body has been a werewolf for considerably longer, and it has been handling that without my permission or input, so I have had to adapt quickly. She almost smiled. I said, can I see the rest of the file? She turned the laptop back toward herself and scrolled, and then turned it back, and the next page was not about me. It was about my mother. Not the car accident version. The real version. Dates and locations and a column that was labeled extraction cycle, and the numbers in that column were the thing that made the room go quiet around me even though nothing had changed. The laptops were still humming. The building was still settling. I was still sitting in this chair, but something in the air shifted because those numbers were dates and the dates were regular, and they went back years and years and years, and I understood what I was looking at before I had the words for it. I said, they have been taking from her this whole time. Sable said yes. I said, she is alive. Sable said yes. Her voice had something in it that was not entirely steady. I said, you knew. She said, I found out recently. Not the full picture. Pieces. Things that didn't add up. I started pulling on threads about 2 months ago, and the file on you was what I was given when I asked too many questions. Like they were redirecting me. Giving me a new assignment to stop me looking at the old ones. I sat with that. I said, so they gave you me to hunt so you would stop investigating what they were doing to the wolves you already delivered. She said yes. I said, and instead of delivering me, you started leaving me notes on how to not get caught. She said, I wasn't ready to examine my reasons for that at the time. I said, are you ready now? She looked at me across the table in that apartment above the laundry supply shop with the books everywhere, and the map with its pins, and the coffee ring on the wood, and she said, I think you might be the most inconvenient thing that has ever happened to me. I said, that is genuinely the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, and I need you to know my bar was already very low. She laughed. Actually laughed. Short and surprised and real, like it had escaped before she could catch it. And then she pressed her fingers against her mouth like she was startling herself, and I sat across from her and felt something bloom in my chest that I had absolutely no time for and zero emotional bandwidth to process, and would need to deal with at a later date when my life was not actively on fire. I said, okay. So, my mother is alive and being held somewhere and drained regularly, and the organization you work for has a darker agenda than you were told, and there is something specific about my bloodline that they want. What else do you know? She sobered. Pulled the laptop back. Started typing. She said the organization is called Cadrith. They have been operating for over 60 years. Publicly, they are a research and containment organization. Wildlife anomaly management is the phrase they use. Privately, they have been running extraction facilities for decades. What they extract from werewolves they call the compound internally. What it does is... She paused. I said, what does it do? She said, it extends human life. Significantly. The inner circle of Cadrith has been using it on themselves for years. Some of the founding members are still alive, Zavara. People who should be in their 90s and hundreds. They don't age the way they should. They heal faster. They are stronger than they have any right to be. I stared at her. I said, they built an entire hunting organization as a personal fountain of youth. She said yes. I said, and you have been their most efficient supplier for how long? She said 6 years. Since I was 16. I said, they recruited you at 16. She said, they recruited me at 12. Full active fieldwork started at 16. I sat back in my chair. I said, Sable. She said, don't. I said, I am not going to say anything you don't already know. I'm just going to sit here and feel things about it for a moment, if that's all right. She said, fine. I said, 12 years old. She said, I said, don't. I said, I'm not saying it critically, I'm saying it because someone should have said something about it a long time ago, and apparently no one did. She was quiet. I said, what did they tell you to make you do it? She said, they told me my mother was killed by a werewolf when I was 8. They said I had a gift for tracking and instinct, and that I could protect people from what had hurt my family if I trained with them. I said, and you believe them? She said, I was 8 years old, and I had just lost my mother, and someone handed me a purpose. Yes, I believed them. The room was very quiet. I said, Sable, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it before you react. She looked at me. I said, the woman on the phone tonight. The one who told me my mother was alive. She also told me something about your mother. Her hands went still on the table. I said, your mother did not die in a wolf attack. Your mother found out what Cadrith was doing, and she tried to warn mine. She got a message to my mother before they came for her. And when Cadrith found out what she had done, they... I stopped. Sable said, finish it. I said, they silenced her. Not wolves. Cadrith. The people who told you wolves killed your mother were the people who actually took her from you. If you are watching this and you can feel the weight of that moment, then you already understand why what happens next between these two women is inevitable. Comment the word anchor below if you felt that. And stay with us, because the story does not stop here. It is only now becoming what it was always meant to be. She stood up. Not in an aggressive way. In the way people stand up when they need their body to do something, because the alternative is letting the feeling stay entirely inside where it has no room. She walked to the window. Stood there with her back to me. I could see her reflection in the dark glass and her face was doing something I did not have the right to watch, so I looked at the table instead. She stood there for a long time. I waited. I am not always good at waiting. I am the person who fills silences with words I haven't finished thinking through yet and asks questions before I have processed the last answer and narrates my own distress aloud because the inside of my head gets too loud. But I waited for her. I sat in that chair and I let her have the window and the dark and the time to feel the shape of what she had just been handed. Eventually she said, "How do we find them?" Not if. How? I said the woman on the phone knows where the facility is. She has known for years, but she could not move alone. She needed someone on the inside. Sable said she needed someone like me. I said yes. She turned from the window. Her face was different now. Not closed. Not the careful professional stillness. Something had opened in it that was going to take time to name, but I recognized the shape of it because I had felt the same thing the night I sat on my kitchen floor with the book in my lap and my father's voice in my ear telling me the truth about what I was. The shape of someone deciding to stop running from what they know. She said, "I need to make some calls. And I need you to sleep. When did you say your next shift starts?" I said 6 a.m. She said it is currently 2:15 in the morning. I said I am aware. She said you cannot go into a shift on no sleep while mid-transformation. Do you understand what that risks? I said I also cannot pay my father's medical bills with personal growth, so. She looked at me with an expression that was somewhere between exasperated and something gentler that she was not going to name out loud and said, "I have a couch." I said I am not sleeping on your couch. She said it is a very good couch. I said I don't know you well enough to sleep on your couch. She said you got in my car at 2 in the morning to go to a stranger's apartment based on notes slid under your door. The couch is the reasonable part of this evening. I opened my mouth. Closed it. She had a point. She had an extremely valid point, and I resented it. I said fine. 1 hour. She said 4 hours. I said 2. She said 3, and I will set an alarm and make sure you get to your shift. I said you would do that. She said I have been making sure you get to your shift safely for 3 months. This is not new. I sat with that for a second. 3 months of her watching. 3 months of notes and books and anonymous help and a woman who was supposed to be hunting me standing between me and whatever was coming instead. I said okay. 3 hours. She nodded and went to make her calls and I lay down on her couch, which was, I will not pretend otherwise, genuinely an excellent couch, and I pressed my hand against my sternum the way she had told me to, the way the book had confirmed. And I said my name twice in my head. Zavara. Zavara. Anchor. I was asleep in 4 minutes. She woke me at 5:15 with coffee that was better than anything I had made myself in 7 months and a look on her face that said her calls had given her information she was still processing and we needed to talk, but not right now, not before your shift. And I drank the coffee standing up in her kitchen while she told me in short, precise sentences what she had learned overnight. The facility was 3 hours outside the city. My mother was there. Had been there for 19 years. There were others. Not as many as there had been. The extraction process was not designed for long-term survival, and most did not last more than a few years. My mother had lasted because of her bloodline. Because she regenerated. Because she was valuable enough to keep barely alive. She was running out of time. The compound was why. And there was one more thing. I said what? Sable said the reason your bloodline is particularly valuable. The reason they sent me after you specifically instead of continuing with your mother. I said tell me. She said half-born wolves produce a compound that is not only more potent than full wolves. It is more stable in human biology. Fewer side effects. Longer lasting. They have been trying to synthesize it for years and they cannot. They need the source. I said they need me. She said they have needed you since you started turning. Your mother's compound was their proof of concept. You are supposed to be their permanent supply. I stood in her kitchen with the coffee in my hand and I thought about 19 years of my mother in a facility being slowly emptied. I thought about my father writing his cartoon notebook in a hospital bed. I thought about the scratches on my back and the broken window and the wool breath control diagram with its little star hands. I said, "We are getting her out." Sable said yes. I said, "And then we are burning the whole thing down." She looked at me. She said yes. I put the coffee down. I picked up my bag with the soup stain on the jacket. I said, "I have a double shift, and then I am going to visit my father, and then I am coming back here tonight, and we are going to make a plan." She said okay. I stopped at the door. I said, "Sable." She looked at me. I said, "Thank you. For the notes. For the book. For the couch. For the coffee. For all of it." She said, "Don't thank me yet." I said, "I am thanking you now while things are still relatively manageable because I have a feeling things are about to become significantly less manageable and I want it on record." She said, "Noted." I said, "Also your couch really is excellent. Whatever you paid for it was worth it." She said, "Goodbye, Zavara." I left. I walked to my shift in the early morning city with coffee in my system and 3 hours of real sleep and something in my chest that felt different from anything I had felt in months, and I thought about a woman 3 hours outside the city who had been waiting in the dark for 19 years. "Hang on, Mom. I'm coming." I'm clumsy and undertrained and working with instructions that are 80% cartoon and 20% educated guessing, and I have feelings for the woman who was supposed to hand me over to the people who took you, and I have not slept properly since the spring. But I am coming. The diner shift started badly and got worse. My coworker Russ, who was 24 years old and deeply committed to making everyone around him participate in whatever emotional weather he was experiencing that day, arrived 12 minutes late, spilled an entire pot of coffee within the first 20 minutes, and then had the audacity to look at me specifically, and say, "You seem different today. Did something happen?" I said, "Nothing happened, Russ." He said, "No, something definitely happened. You have a thing on your face." I said, "I have a face on my face." He said, "A look." "You have a look. Did you meet someone?" I said, "I am going to put this tray down, and when I pick it back up I need you to not be asking me that question anymore." He said, "I knew it." He said this with the energy of someone who had won something significant. He pointed at me with a coffee stirrer and said, "I knew it, who is it?" I said, "Table 4 needs their eggs, Russ." He said, "After eggs you are telling me everything." I did not tell him everything. I told him nothing. But I spent the entire shift acutely aware of the fact that I had slept on Sable's couch and drunk her excellent coffee and felt things in her kitchen that I did not have time for, and my coworker, who had the emotional perception of a golden retriever, had clocked it immediately, which meant I was not hiding it as well as I thought. The shift was also complicated by the fact that my hearing had apparently decided today was the day to upgrade itself without my consent. I could hear everything. The couple at table 7 was whispering about a disagreement they'd had the night before that was ostensibly about dishwasher loading technique, but was very clearly about something else entirely. The man at the counter was on a phone call with someone named Patricia, and from his side of the conversation, Patricia had recently done something that he found unreasonable, and he was working very hard to sound calm about it. The cook in the back had a song in his head that he was humming under his breath, and he had been cycling through the same 8 bars for 40 minutes. I could also smell everything, which was less charming and more immediately distressing in a building where the primary activities were cooking and consuming food, and which had not had its ventilation system serviced in what smelled like a geological era. I dropped one order. I wrote down the wrong thing for another. I smiled at the wrong moments and forgot to smile at the right ones. Russ kept looking at me with the specific concern of someone who does not know what is wrong but is very invested in figuring it out. At one point between tables, I went to the back and stood in front of the cold storage unit and pressed my hand against the metal door and said my name twice in my head and waited for the thing rising in my chest to settle. It settled. Mostly. The cook walked by, saw me pressing my forehead against the cold storage door with my eyes closed and my lips moving slightly, and decided very reasonably not to ask. I respect him for that. I got through the shift. I went to see my father. He was having a good day, which meant he was sitting up and the television was on, and he had eaten most of his lunch, and when I came in he said, "There she is," like he always does. Like I am the best thing he has seen all day, which I probably am because hospital days are long and the television gets repetitive. I sat in the chair beside his bed, and he told me about a documentary he had watched that morning about wolves in Yellowstone, and he said with genuine scholarly confidence that apparently wolves are very family-oriented, and I said, yes, Dad, I have heard that. He said it made him think about the Notebook. He said he wondered if he had gotten some of it right. I said, you got some of it right. He said, which parts? I thought about the wolf breath exercise and the cheese curfew and the silver bracelet theory. I said the part where you told me I was strong. I said that one I have found to be accurate. He smiled. He held my hand. He said your mother would be so proud of you. I looked at our hands together, and I thought about a facility 3 hours outside the city, and a woman being slowly emptied, and the plan that was forming between me and a hunter who was supposed to deliver me, and had decided instead to leave notes on my door. I said, I know, Dad. I said, I think she might get to see it herself someday. He looked at me. I said, I will explain later. Rest now. He did not push. He was tired in the way he always was by the afternoon, and I sat with him until he drifted off, and then I sat a little longer, because the feeling of his hand in mine was the thing I was going to carry into whatever came next. Then I went back to Sable. She had been busy. The table that had held 3 laptops now held all 3 laptops plus printed documents plus 2 new notebooks plus a detailed hand-drawn map that was considerably more accurate looking than anything in my father's safe, and she had clearly not slept at all in there. Were 2 coffee mugs and an empty wrapper from something she had eaten at the table without stopping. I walked in and looked at it and said, have you been here this entire time? She said, most of it. I said, did you sleep? She said, I will sleep after. I said, after what? She said, after I figure out how we do this without getting you killed. I stood in the doorway of her apartment above the laundry supply shop and looked at this woman who had been watching over me for 3 months and had spent her entire life being pointed at things and told they were the enemy, and had somewhere along the way started quietly refusing to be the weapon she was built to be, and I felt the thing in my chest again that I had no bandwidth for. I said, how many people know what we are planning? She said, 3, including us. I said, who is the 3rd? She said, the woman you called Osavane. She has been waiting a long time for someone on the inside to turn. She knows the facility. She knows the layout. She knows the schedule. I said, how does she know all that? Sable said, because she used to work for Kadrith. Before she understood what they were. I said, and now she wants to burn it down. She said, now she wants to burn it down. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and looked at the map and the documents and the notes in her handwriting that were precise and detailed and nothing at all like cartoon star hands. I said, okay. She looked at me. I said, walk me through it. And she did. For 2 hours she walked me through everything she knew and everything Osavane had given her, and everything the files she had been pulling from Kadritha's internal system had told her, and I sat across from her and listened and asked questions and occasionally said something that made her pause and reconsider, and occasionally she said something that made me press my hand against my sternum and breathe. At some point she made more coffee. At some point our chairs had moved closer to the table and therefore closer to each other without either of us acknowledging it. At some point her hand had moved across the table to tap a point on the map and had not moved back and was resting 2 inches from mine, and neither of us said anything about it, but neither of us moved. I said, I need to tell you something. She said, okay. I said, I have not done this before. Any of this. The wolf thing obviously, but also the other thing. I do not have a lot of experience with any of it. I want you to know that before whatever is about to happen happens. She was very still. I said, I am telling you this not because I need you to do anything about it right now. I am just telling you because I have had very few things in the last several months that felt like mine, and this feels like mine, and I wanted to say it out loud at least once before we go do something that might get us killed. She said, Zavara. I said, you don't have to say anything back, I just needed to. She said, Zavara. I said, yes. She moved her hand the 2 inches. Her fingers over mine on the table. Just that. Just her hand over mine, and the warmth of it, and the fact that her eyes, when I looked up, were saying something that her mouth was not ready for yet, and that was fine. That was more than fine. That was everything. She said, after. I said, after. She said, we get your mother out. We bring the whole thing down. And then after. I said, deal. She squeezed my hand once and then let go and picked up her pen and said now. There is a shift change at the facility at 3 a.m. on Thursdays. That is our window. We have 4 days. I said 4 days. She said I need to teach you 3 things before we go in. How to control the shift on command. How to use it without losing yourself. And how to get back out if we get separated. I said, and what are you going to use? She said I have my own skills. I said which are. She looked at me and said I have been the best hunter they have for 6 years. I know every protocol. Every weakness. Every blind spot in their system. I built most of their containment procedures. I sat with that. I said, so you are going to use the fact that you know exactly how they hunt to dismantle them. She said yes. I said that is genuinely excellent. That is the most poetic thing I have heard all week. She almost smiled. Again. She was so close to a real full smile so many times, and every time it was the most interesting thing happening in whatever room we were in. I said one more question. She said what? I said when we find my mother. What condition is she likely to be in? The almost smile went away. She said honest answer. I said always. She said she will be weak. The extraction process is degenerative over time. She will likely not be at full strength or anywhere close to it. She may not recognize you immediately. She has been in there for 19 years, Savara. She is not going to be the woman your father described. I said, but she will be alive. She said yes. She will be alive. I said then that is enough. That is the starting point. Everything else we figure out after. She nodded. I said okay. She said okay. I looked at the map. 4 days. 3 a.m. on a Thursday. A facility 3 hours outside the city that had been running for 60 years on the suffering of people who deserved better. A mother who had been waiting in the dark. A father in a hospital bed watching wolf documentaries and getting about 20% of them right. A woman across the table from me who had spent her whole life being a weapon for people who lied to her about everything that mattered. And me. Zavara. Half human, half wolf. Working 3 jobs. Running on diner coffee and star hands breathing exercises and the completely unscientific but surprisingly effective method of saying my own name twice when things got bad. Anchor. If you have made it this far into this story, then you already know that what those 4 days of training look like, what Savara learns about what she is actually capable of, what Sable discovers about herself in the process of teaching her, is the kind of thing that cannot be summarized. It has to be felt. So subscribe. Right now. Turn on notifications. Because the next part of this story is where everything that has been building finally starts to move, and I promise you nothing about what happens at that facility is what either of them expects. Not the layout. Not the guards. Not what they find in the lower levels. And not what Zavara's mother says when she finally sees her daughter's face for the first time in 19 years. Drop a comment below. Tell me which character you are. Are you a Zavara, trying everything and failing forward and feeling too much all the time? Or are you a Sable, holding it together on the outside while something quietly falls apart on the inside? I want to know. Because either way the story is yours now too. The 4 days passed in a way that felt both endless and terrifyingly fast. Day 1 was learning the shift. Not suppressing it. Not white-knuckling it back into the box where I had been keeping it. Actually using it. Letting it come and finding the point where I could hold it, half in and half out, like standing in a doorway. Sable's method for teaching this was not what I expected. She did not use clinical exercises or breathing techniques or anything from a manual. She stood in the middle of her cleared living room, furniture pushed to the walls, and she said, "Tell me something that makes you angry." I said, "What?" She said, "Tell me something that makes you angry. Something real. Not surface level. Something that sits in your chest and does not go away." I said, "This feels like therapy." She said, "It is not therapy, it is calibration." Tell me. I thought about it. I said, "The organization. What they have been doing. What they did to my mother. What they told you about yours." She said, "Good. Feel that. Don't push it down. Let it come up." I let it come up. The shift started at the edges. The familiar pressure behind my eyes, the way the room's colors shifted slightly, the sensation in my hands that was somewhere between electricity and heat. She said, "Stop it there." I said, "I can't just." She said, "You can." You stopped it before. You know where the edge is. Stand at the edge. Don't go over and don't come back. Stand there. I stood there. It was like holding a door open against wind. Possible. But you had to keep your whole body in it. She said good. Now walk to the window. I said She said while you're at the edge, yes. Move normally. Do a normal thing. Let your body learn that it can do both. I walked to the window. Everything was slightly louder and slightly sharper, and the city outside looked different from this threshold, more vivid, more present, like I had been watching it through glass my whole life and someone had opened the window. She said, what do you hear? I said, everything. The couple from table 7 are apparently still arguing about the dishwasher. Someone 3 floors below is watching a film. There is a cat on the roof. She said, good. Come back. I came back. The shift receded. I stood in the middle of her living room feeling like I had just run a short distance very fast. She said that was good. I said that was terrifying. She said it will stop being terrifying. I said, how do you know? She looked at me and said, because I have watched you learn every other thing about this in real time and you are faster than you know. I stood there. I said, was that a compliment? She said it was an observation. I said it felt like a compliment. She said, do you want to run the exercise again? I said yes, but I am also going to take the compliment. She said, I know. Day 2 was worse because it was the day Osavane came. She arrived in the morning. Small woman. Older. White hair that she wore pulled back and eyes that had seen too many things and processed all of them and arrived at a particular kind of calm that was not peace exactly, but was what happened after you ran out of the energy to be afraid. She looked at me when she walked in the door and she stopped. She said, you look like her. I said, I know. She said, around the eyes especially. I said, my father tells me that. She came in and she sat at the table and she told us everything she knew about the facility in the precise, methodical way of someone who had been organizing this information in their head for years, waiting for a moment to put it somewhere useful. She had worked for Kadrith for 11 years. She had believed the mission. She had been a researcher, not a hunter, and she had told herself that the distance between her lab work and the facility made her less responsible for it. She had stopped telling herself that when she had gone to the lower levels for the first time and seen what was actually in there. She had left 18 months later. Carefully. In a way that did not raise flags. She had taken nothing with her except what was in her memory, and that was enough. She told us the layout. The shift changes. The security rotations. The location of the lower levels where long-term subjects were kept. She told us which systems Sable's access codes would still work on and which ones had likely been updated. She looked at Sable when she said that and said they will know you are coming. Maybe not before you arrive, but the moment you use your credentials they will know. Sable said, I know. Osavane said, you understand what that means. Sable said, it means I am burning every bridge I have left with the organization the moment we walk in. Osavane said yes. Sable said good. Osavane looked at her for a long time. Then she said, your mother was a good woman. She said it quietly and with the particular weight of someone who had been waiting to say it to the right person. Sable's hands went flat on the table again. She said, did you know her? Osavane said, I knew of her. I knew what she tried to do. I knew what it cost her. And I know that what she did was why your mother did not make it, and why Zavara's mother survived long enough for them to take her to the facility instead. Sable said, so my mother's warning gave Vera enough time to get away initially. Osavane said enough time to get far enough that they had to chase her. Enough time that when they caught her she was too valuable to dispose of. So yes, in a way, your mother's last act was the reason Zavara's mother is still alive. The room was very quiet. I looked at Sable. She was looking at the table. I moved my hand across the table. 2 inches. The same 2 inches as before. My hand over hers. She did not look up, but I felt her hand turn slightly under mine. Osavane watched this and said nothing and had the wisdom to move to the next page of information. Day 3 was physical. Sable taught me how to fight with the shift instead of against it. I had been trained to fight as a human by my father's careful instruction. Good technique. Solid fundamentals. The kind of fighting that works on a normal Thursday when nothing is trying to transform you from the inside out. This was different. The shift changes your weight distribution, your reach, the way you absorb impact. Sable knew this not from experience, but from 6 years of learning exactly how to neutralize it, which meant she knew it intimately from the outside and could translate it for the inside. We went 3 hours. She was faster than she looked. More precise than should have been possible. And she had a specific way of moving that was very efficient and slightly maddening to try to get around. I landed on the floor 4 times in the first hour. I said, "You're enjoying this." She said, "I am not enjoying this." I said, "Your face is doing something." She said, "I am focused." I said, "Your focused face looks exactly like an enjoying this face." She helped me up and immediately used the hand that was helping me to redirect my balance, and I went sideways and had to catch myself on the wall. She said again. I said, "I just said you were enjoying this, and you used our moment of connection to throw me against a wall." She said, "I used your inattention during a moment of connection to demonstrate that sentiment is a vulnerability in the field." I said, "That is the meanest thing." She said again. I went again. By hour 3 I had stopped landing on the floor and started landing on my feet, and there was one moment toward the end where I caught her off balance slightly, just slightly, and she had to take a step back. And the look on her face in that moment was worth every single floor landing of the preceding hours. I said, "Was that good?" She said, "That was very good." I said, "Your face is doing the thing again." She said, "I genuinely do not know what you are talking about." I said, "Yes, you do." She almost smiled. All the way this time. Not quite, but closer than I had seen yet. And then she said we should eat something and went to the kitchen, and I stood in the middle of the cleared living room and pressed my hand against my sternum and said my name twice in my head and added one word to the ritual. Zavara. Zavara. Anchor. Ready. Day 4 we did not train. Day 4 we just existed in the same space and let ourselves be normal for a few hours because after tomorrow nothing was going to be the same and we both knew it, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do before something irreversible is let yourself have one quiet day. She made food. Actual food, not coffee and whatever was in the wrapper. Something with rice and vegetables and more flavor than I expected from someone whose apartment suggested they survived primarily on caffeine and mission focus. I said, "You can cook." She said, "I can do several things you haven't seen yet." I said, "Was that?" She said it was a statement of fact. I said it was absolutely not just a statement of fact. She brought the food to the table and sat across from me and we ate, and I told her about my father and the first time he tried to explain puberty to me using an analogy that went so badly sideways that we both agreed never to speak of it again, and she laughed. A real one this time, full and unguarded, and it was the best sound I had heard in months. She told me about a mission 3 years ago where she had tracked a wolf for 11 days through 3 cities and finally found him working in a bakery and making, by her account, genuinely excellent bread, and she had sat outside that bakery for 2 days filing her report and not submitting it because she could not make herself do it, and eventually he had disappeared before she made a decision, and she had told herself it was fine and it was a failure and not allowed herself to examine which of those things felt more true. I said, "What do you think happened to him?" She said, "I think he kept making bread." I hope he did. I said, "Me too." She said, "I have been not submitting reports for about 2 years. Small ones. Edge cases. Things I told myself were inconclusive." I said, "How many?" She said, "Enough that if they ever audit properly, I am already compromised." I said, "So you were already becoming this before me?" She said, "I was already becoming this. You just accelerated the timeline." I said, "Because of my file." She said, "Because I watched you try your father's breathing exercise at 2 in the morning through your window, and you did the star hands thing, and then you looked so genuinely betrayed when it didn't work, and I thought, this specific person I cannot." She stopped. I said, "You cannot what?" She said, "I cannot be the thing that happens to her." I sat with that. I said, "So you became the thing that helped me instead?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Sable." She said, "Yes." I said, "I am very glad you watched me do the star hands breathing exercise at 2 in the morning." She looked at me across the table with our empty plates and the map and the documents and 4 days of everything that had happened between us, and she said, "So am I." I reached across the table. She met me halfway. Neither of us said anything for a while after that. Neither of us needed to. We left at midnight. Asavane stayed behind. She had done what she could do. The rest was ours. The drive was 3 hours, and we spent most of it in a comfortable quiet that was different from the silences of the first night. That silence had been two people being careful around each other. This one was two people who had run out of careful and were just present. Together. She drove. I watched the city give way to roads, and then to darker roads, and then to the particular darkness of somewhere that is not meant to be found. At some point I fell asleep for 40 minutes. I know because I woke up and we were somewhere I did not recognize, and she had let me sleep and turned the heater up slightly. I said, how much further? She said 40 minutes. I said, are you okay? She said, I am going to burn down the only life I have ever known tonight. I said, I know. She said, and I am more okay than I expected to be. I said, I think that is because you already knew it needed burning. She said, yes. I said, I will be there after. She said, I know. I said, okay. She said, okay. The facility was not what I expected, and I had not known what to expect, so perhaps that is not saying much, but still. It was built into a hillside. From the outside, it looked like a logistics company. Unremarkable. Industrial. The kind of building you drive past on a highway and your eyes slide off without snagging. We parked a kilometer away. We went over the plan one more time in the car in low voices. She said, when we get to the lower levels, whatever condition she is in, you do not stop moving until we are out. Whatever you feel, you process after. I said, I understand. She said, I mean it, Zavara. I have seen what long-term subjects look like. It will be hard. And I need you moving. I said, I will be moving. I promise. She nodded. I said, Sable. She said, yes. I said, after this. Whatever after looks like. I am in it. She looked at me in the dark car on the empty road 40 minutes from the thing we were about to do, and she said, I know. Me too. We got out of the car. The shift change was at 3 a.m. We had 12 minutes. We moved. She had been right about her credentials. They worked for the first 3 doors, and then on the 4th door something changed in the system, and she looked at me and said, we have maybe 8 minutes before they know exactly where we are in the building. I said, 8 minutes is enough. She said, we need to find the lower levels in 8 minutes. I said, I can find them. She said, how? I said, the same way I found the cat on the roof on day 1. She looked at me. I let the shift come to the edge, held the doorway, and I opened everything up. The building was loud in ways it had not been from outside. Systems running, air cycling, and underneath all of that something else. A sound that was not mechanical. Something that breathed. Below us. I said this way and I moved and she followed. We found the stairwell. We found the lower levels. We found the corridor. And at the end of the corridor there were doors. I stopped in front of the 3rd one. I pressed my hand against the metal. She said, how do you know? I said, I know. She used her credentials. They still worked on this one. The door opened. The room was small, lit by the kind of light that is functional and nothing else. Medical equipment along one wall. A bed. She was in the bed. Smaller than I had imagined. Thinner. Her hair was long and dark, and her face had the particular exhausted stillness of someone who had spent years conserving everything. Every breath. Every movement. Her eyes were open. She looked at me, and I watched something happen in her face that was the most painful and the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life. Because I watched her know me. Across 19 years and everything they had done to her and all the ways her body had been emptied out, she looked at my face and she knew me, and something that had been closed for a very long time opened. She said, your name. Barely a sound. More breath than voice. She said, Zavara. I was across the room before I had decided to move. I said, I've got you. I said, I've got you, I've got you, I've got you. She was lighter than she should have been. Like something that had been gradually removed from her over years had taken weight with it. But her arms came around me and they held, and they were her arms and they were real, and she was here, she was here, she was here. Sable was already moving. Unhooking things carefully. Making assessments. Her voice quiet and steady behind me saying, she's stable, she can be moved, we need to go now. I helped my mother stand. She stood. Slowly. With effort. But she stood. She looked at Sable. Something passed between them. An older knowledge. The shape of a face she recognized from a different face. Sable's face. Her mother's face. She reached out and put one hand against Sable's jaw. She said, "I know who you are. Your mother. She saved us time." Sable said she did. My mother said she was a good woman. Sable said, "I know. I know that now." My mother nodded. She lowered her hand. She said, "Let's go." We went. The alarm started 4 corridors from the exit. They were loud and they were everywhere, and the lights shifted to something red, and I felt the shift surge in response to the noise, and I held the doorway and said, "Zavara, Zavara, anchor," and kept moving. Sable moved like she had been born for this, which in a terrible way she had, and she made decisions in real time that were the right decisions every time, left not right, this door not that one, because she knew the protocols, she had written some of them. And they could not outmaneuver their own architect. We came out of a side exit into the night air. Cold. Dark. The trees around the facility pressing close. We moved to the trees. We kept moving. When we reached the car, my mother sat in the back and I sat beside her and held her hand, and Sable drove, and nobody said anything for a long time because we were all somewhere inside the enormity of what had just happened and the words had not caught up yet. Eventually my mother said his name. My father's name. I said, "He is alive. He is sick, but he is alive. He has been waiting for you in the way that good people wait. Quietly. Without giving up." She turned her face toward the window. I squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. I looked at Sable in the front seat, and she met my eyes briefly in the mirror, and what passed between us in that look was too large and too various to name, but I held it anyway. We drove back toward the city as the sky began to consider morning. I want you to know that what came after was not simple. It was not a single conversation or a single document leaked to the right journalist or a single moment where everything resolved. Kadrith was 60 years old. Its roots were deep and its reach was long, and dismantling it was the work of months, and some of it was loud and some of it was the slow grinding work of evidence and testimonies and Osavane's careful documentation and Sable walking into rooms full of people who thought they owned her and laying everything she knew on the table like a weapon she had been carrying for years without knowing it was a weapon. There were consequences. For Sable most of all. The life she had built inside the organization was over. The identity she had constructed around her mission was gone. She had to find out who she was when she was not being pointed at things. She found out she was someone who cooked well and read voraciously and almost smiled constantly and had been waiting her whole life without knowing it for permission to stop. My father cried when he saw my mother. He cried the way people cry when they have carried something for so long that putting it down takes everything out of them. She sat on the edge of his hospital bed, and he held her face in his hands and said, "I told her about you every day," and she said, "I know. She found you. I knew she would find you." My mother came back slowly. The way things that have been diminished come back. Not to what she was, perhaps not ever completely, but to herself. To something that was hers. She started sleeping through the night. She started eating. She started, in the careful way of someone relearning a language they dreamed in, starting to access what they had been draining from her and finding it was not gone. Only quiet. She and Sable spent a lot of time together in those months. Learning the shape of what their mothers had meant to each other. Sable learning who her mother actually was, not the story she had been given. My mother telling her. Not everything, not all at once, but piece by piece in the way that truth comes back after a long time in the dark. My father came home eventually. Not well exactly. But better. He sat in the kitchen, and he watched my mother exist in the same space as him, and you could see what that did for him. The particular nutrition of it. He asked me one night if his notebook had helped at all. I said, "Dad. The wolf breath thing. I use it every day." He said the Star Hands version or the adapted version. I said the adapted version, but your version started me off. He looked so pleased I almost told him about the cheese curfew, but I didn't. Some things are acts of love. I quit 2 of my 3 jobs. Kept the diner. Russ cried, actually cried, when I told him I was only keeping 1 shift a week, and then composed himself and said, "Okay, but you have to tell me everything now." Everything. Starting with the girl. I told him some of it. He said, "I knew it, I knew it, I knew it." Sable came to the diner once and sat at the counter, and Russ brought her coffee with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment and found it entirely satisfactory. After he walked away, she said, "Your coworker has a lot of feelings." I said, "He really does." She said, "I like him." I said, "Don't tell him that he will never recover." She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug and looked at me over the rim of it and said, "How are you?" I said, "I pressed my hand against my sternum this morning and said my name twice and nothing surged. It just settled. First time." She said, "That is progress." I said, "I think I'm figuring out what I am." She said, "I think you figured that out a while ago." I said, "I think you're right." She put the coffee down. She said, "I am beginning to think I might be okay. Eventually. I am not there yet, but I can see the direction." I said, "That is enough. That is the starting point." She looked at me. I said, "Everything else we figure out after." She reached across the counter. I met her halfway. And Russ, from the other end of the counter, made a sound that was extremely undignified for a professional food service environment, and I did not even turn around because some moments you just have to let happen without managing them. I pressed my hand against my sternum. Everything was still. Zavara. Zavara. Anchor. Here. If you stayed for this whole story, then you already know what it cost and what it gave back and why the ending feels the way it feels, like something earned and something beginning at the same time. Drop a comment below and tell me what you felt. Tell me which moment broke you open. Tell me which line you are going to carry with you. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who is in the middle of their own chaos, trying to figure out what they are and whether they are going to make it through. They are going to make it through. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because Zavara and Sable's story is complete, but the world they exist in is not, and there are other stories in it that deserve to be told. Thank you for staying. Thank you for watching. Anchor.